Okay, well, I think we'll kick off, and as people join, so great to see everyone again this evening. Very cold and chilly here in Sydney. Basically, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Got a fabulous session as always tonight. So we're going to hear in a minute from Tim Buckley, who's the director Climate Energy Finance. And then after that, we're going to hear from Joey Clark, who is the Senior Science Communications Lead at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. And I think the format for this evening, so we'll hear from Tim first and then go to questions and then to Joey and do the same with questions. But given there's just a lot going on at the moment around the world and everything, we thought we'd sort of, particularly in the session with yourself, Tim, we might sort of you've got such a wealth of knowledge, we might sort of free range a bit and just see where it takes us as well. Yep. So please do jump on. Lots of questions as always, and we'll go from there. So just jumping straight in then to introduce Tim Buckley. So Tim is the Director, Climate Energy Finance, as I mentioned. Prior to this, Tim was the Director of Energy Finance Studies, Australia, South Asia at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. For many years, he was also the Managing Director, Head of Equity Research at Citigroup. Tim's also a member of our Environment Group. He's got an incredible wealth of knowledge, as I just mentioned, and is very visible, very influential, and highly respected. So originally, we asked Tim to sort of talk about the recent budget and its impact on the environment and biodiversity. But I suppose since we asked that, and we'll definitely cover that, really keen to hear about Tim's recent trip to China, because I've seen some of your posts there, Tim. It looks fascinating. So we'd love to sort of pick your brains on that. And I know you've also been very vocal around the coalition's nuclear plan. So we thought we might just talk a bit about that as well and whatever else that takes us. So thank you very much, Tim, for joining us, and over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephen and Caroline. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to, as you say, have a free-ranging discussion rather than a monologue from me. That's not what anyone needs at 8 o'clock on a Monday night. But maybe just to set the scene. And as you mentioned, I run a very small public interest think tank, Climate Energy Finance. We've got no government funding, no corporate funding, no finance funding. So we're funded 100% by philanthropy. So I mentioned that much as I am opinionated, as Stephen and Caroline know, whatever I'm saying is whatever I think is in the public Australian interest, and we have no conflicts of interest. I say that particularly given for many, many years, 17 years, I was head of research at Citigroup, the biggest bank in the world, and all I did was manage conflicts of interest between our investment bank and our institutional clients. So I'm very aware of how almost everyone in any particular debate's got conflicts of interest, any corporate debate, any policy debate. I'm happy to say, proud to say that I am funded by philanthropy, therefore able to actually look at it as, I can easily be wrong, I happily admit that, but at least what I'm doing is trying to put facts around the discussion to push back in particular on the fossil fuel stooges, climate deniers, and people whose jobs depend on them not being willing to accept or act on the climate science, which unfortunately is most of our federal politicians and state politicians. But anyway, so moving on to what I consider to be a really positive topic, China. I was privileged 3 weeks ago to head over to Shanghai, Greater Shanghai. We went to 6 different cities over 10 days. I went on a delegation of 23 Australians, led by the ex-Premier of Queensland, Anastasia Palaszczuk. It was a privilege to get to know her in a relaxed forum and to hear discussions about how governments operate from someone who's been at the absolute top of their game for a decade and then being now actually free to talk. So that was interesting in its own right. But Smart Energy Council organised a great tour, and they took 23 people, all of whom had very high levels of experience in the Australian renewables industry. And we got to actually meet with a number of Chinese global technology clean tech leaders. We went to 6 factories of 6 of the biggest clean tech companies in the world. We had factory tours for a couple of hours each factory. that span from solar modules to inverters to hydrogen to electric vehicles and to battery manufacturing. And then we also went to a trade fair, and I'd have to say, until I go back to China, the biggest trade fair in the world. It was 3 days in Shanghai. Over 3 days, they had 600,000 attendees. And I was talking to one of the organizers of that conference, and they mentioned that last year they had 450,000 attendees. And so they've grown by a third in 1 year. It was just amazingly big. And anyway, so everything about China is big. It's enormous. And their economy is growing very strongly. Their leadership in the world in almost every zero emissions technology of the future is crystal clear with daylight second. And certainly my visit reinforced that. But it also reinforced a couple other factors, one of which is just the absolute size of China. So we had the privilege of a private meeting with the mayor of Shanghai. He runs a city of 30 million people. And because we had Anastasia Palaszczuk there, we got a 2-hour private session with just 10 of us talking about clean tech and all their recycling. It was unbelievable, the level of recycling and how clean it was. He was really proudly highlighting that they're getting down towards zero waste landfill. Just staggering. Any idea that Australia is a first world country and China is a developing country is just pure crap. And one of the problems I see is that China still hides behind the pretense that it's a developing country. It's not. It's one of the 2 most powerful countries in the world. It's the 2 most powerful economies in the world, 1.3 billion people. And when you see a city of 30 million people and it's beautiful, clean, and just...
Right.
Right.
Sorry, we just lost you for a second there, Tim, but you're back.
Yeah, sorry, I must have dropped out for a sec. Anyway, so jumping back in, everything about the meetings we had was just showing the staggering scale and modern investment technology of China. And we saw some of the biggest factories in the world, the biggest factories in the world. We went to Tesla's Shanghai factory, the biggest EV factory in the world. It's so big you can't see from one end of this factory to another. It produces an EV every 36 seconds. We tried to stuff that up by standing on the production line, and after about 15 seconds, they quickly got us off it because they said if we held it up for another 5 or 10 seconds, they would lose an EV, $20,000 or $30,000 profit down the drain. It was moving that fast. But also the robotics was staggering. The automation was staggering. So we saw driverless trucks. We saw driverless inventory management systems, little robots all over the place, running off to the warehouse, collecting all of the inventory and then bringing it back. And then another robot picking it up out of the basket, sticking it on the car, the battery, the solar module. Some of the factories, literally, it was play spot the worker. There were literally none in the biggest solar module factory in the world. They were maybe down the end at the packaging line, but most of the workers were quality control. They were actually trying to check that the fact that the robots were still making everything perfectly and there to respond if something goes wrong. But one factory, there was literally not one worker in it. It was the biggest module factory in the world. And it was also half a kilometre long. And it was just staggering. So really what we learned was the AI, the robotics that China has is world leading. I believe they're sort of up there with Korea as the top 2 robotics countries in the world. And we saw that firsthand. Not to shame Tesla, because the Tesla factory was pretty bloody amazing, but we then saw another factory called NIO, which is one of the top high-end EV manufacturers. They only made an EV every 1 minute. But there, the number of workers was maybe a fifth of the number of workers in Tesla's factory. So it's built 4 years later. It was built in 2023, 2024. So 4 years later, and they've reduced the workforce by 80%. It's just staggering, the robotics. So the scale, the technology, the investment. We had one meeting, we met with BYD. No, it was CATL. And well, we met with both, but CATL and anyway, John Grimes, the CEO of Smart Energy Council, was giving an introductory talk to explain to all of us who CATL was. And he goes, oh, CATL is one of the biggest battery, or the biggest battery company in the world, and they've got 16,000 people working in R&D alone. And the CAT manager interrupted John and said, sorry, John, that number's out of date. That's from a year ago. We've now got 21,000 people in R&D, research and development. 21,000 people, like, just staggering how innovative they are. We've seen, so as anyone that reads any of my posts or reports knows, I think the global energy transformation is being led by China. It's moving 1,000,000 miles an hour, and things like EVs have already won the race in the passenger vehicle market. Why anyone would even bother with a hydrogen fuel cell car beats me. But one of the, you think about why would EVs not work? And at the moment, there's a bit of a pause in America. EV sales are flatlining, or in fact, marginally down this year. In Europe, they're down. But in China, they're up 30% year on year. And China's half the world's EV sales. India, they're up 28% year on year. So 2 of the 4 biggest markets in the world are still growing at 20-30% per annum. So EVs are still taking over the world at an enormous rate of knots. But the 2 big issues I've heard of in the past are safety of EVs, like they catch fire and you can't put them out. And the second one is range anxiety. So BYD sort of puts an end to both of those. They showed us the latest test in China on batteries is they shoot rifle bullets through the battery to see whether they can actually make them explode. And the BYD blade factory cannot burn. Oliver Yates, the founding CEO of Clean Energy Finance Corporation, was there to go, look at that battery, this is just amazing. Like, the new EVs will literally not burn. The fact that the car won't burn. So put safety concerns aside. Like, if it's a 3rd-tier battery in a shit consumer product, unbranded or whatever, imported without proper regulations, maybe they'll burn. They're the problems. But latest EVs out of China, like BYD EVs, the latest technology cannot burn. The second one was range anxiety, and BYD, while we're there, announced that their latest plug-in hybrid car has a range of 2,000 kilometers. Right, yeah, so kiss goodbye to range anxiety. There's other batteries now that can be recharged 80% in 10 minutes and that sort of stuff. So the technology development is just staggering. That's just batteries. But when you then put batteries with solar, so like, there are numbnuts, and we'll get to nuclear in a sec, but people in Australia going, oh, but we need baseload power, and solar negative power prices are so destructive. Well, tell that to any real economist. Zero energy prices when the sun is sunny, which is literally every day in Australia in summer. That means batteries combined with solar absolutely transform. It's sort of the convergence of 2 technologies. EVs are all about batteries, and solar, put the 2 together and it actually doubles down. So batteries are booming globally, and we just saw a press release from BlackRock, the biggest investor in the world today, talking about how Wellington of New South Wales is getting one of the biggest batteries in the world. It's being built by Accenture, which is a division of BlackRock. That combines with the other big battery. They're building one at Wellington, one in Newcastle. 2 of the 2 biggest batteries in the world, and literally Australia is building 10 of the biggest batteries in the world concurrently, and China's putting in something like 40 gigawatts of battery storage capacity this year. So solar generates really low cost energy when it's sunny. Batteries mean you can time shift that to when you need it. So it's really compounding and accelerating the transformation. So probably the last comment I'd make is that China is moving, and it comes to your point, Stephen, about nuclear. China is moving massively in all zero emissions technologies of the future. They are installing at the moment 20 gigawatts of wind and solar every month. Like, last year, they installed 293 gigawatts of wind and solar. And I mention that because, sure, they are also the biggest investor in nuclear in the world, but last year they installed 1 gigawatt of nuclear and 293 gigawatts of wind and solar. Now, any energy expert will tell you a solar project only runs 20% of the time, a wind project runs 30% of the time, a nuclear project runs 80% of the time, but 1 gigawatt is a rounding error when you're building 293 gigs of solar and wind every year. So it's worth bearing that in mind when the nuclear nutters in Australia say we should be building nuclear, we should put everything on hold for 20 years while we wait for a nuclear power plant to be built. Oh, that's right, because America and China and Europe and everyone else is building nuclear. Yeah, China's building 1 gigawatt a year of nuclear and 300 gigs a year of wind and solar, plus 40 gigs a year of batteries and 10 gigs a year of pumped hydros. So, okay, everything about China is enormous, but we need to put it in perspective. I think we need a much larger element of fact checking on any politicians spruiking anything. And in nuclear, there's a fact-free discussion thanks to the Murdoch media, but as soon as you actually scratch the surface and look at the numbers, look at the economics, look at the scale, look at the time delay, there is no reason why Australia would be putting everything on hold for 20 years while we wait for nuclear to catch up. So ultimately, I'll just finish by saying China is absolutely leading the world. They spend something like twice the amount of investment every year on clean tech that America and Europe spend. And we know the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, saw America throw $1 trillion of government subsidies and capital support into trying to re-industrialize and get America back into the global clean tech race. My response is that China has doubled down and gone twice as fast on the back of the response from America. Now, that is great news. We have a climate emergency, we have a cost of living emergency, we have hyperinflation of energy prices, but certainly what China is doing is putting a high degree of confidence that we actually have the solutions to solve the energy crisis. And I just stuck in the chat a link to an article in the Sydney Morning Herald on the weekend, which talks about how China could well be 6 years ahead of their peak emissions by 2030 Paris commitments. And I am firmly of the view that's correct. So that's great news. It's not saying that the climate crisis is absolutely real. Every scientist forecast has proven to be conservative. So we need to respond at speed and scale. But anyone that's telling you China's a laggard and it doesn't matter what we're doing is just telling you a quarter of the story and ignoring the fact that they are absolutely world leading and driving massive, massive deflation in batteries, in EVs, in solar, and building the capacity and the technologies with every month and every year. So a very positive story out of China, and certainly opens up enormous opportunities for Australia if we can double down and get involved and partner with China and help them decarbonise and build out the technology and investment that they're doing. And that's what Prime Minister Albanese's brought in his Future Made in Australia. But I'll stop my little rant there and hand back to you, Stephen.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Yeah, that's fascinating to hear about your China trip, and that's really so positive as well. Just before we go to sort of questions from the group, I mean, do you want to just say anything about the budget? I know there wasn't really much in the budget, was there? So is there just a couple of thoughts from you on the recent budget, climate and the environment?
Yeah, I beg to differ. There were elements where there was nothing on electrification of the domestic economy. So certainly rewiring Australia and that the government's been talking a lot about that, but there was not much in there. But there was about $23 billion of government subsidies and budget support for the development of clean tech industries. So 23 billion Aussie is nothing compared to $1 trillion US, but our economies may be a 10th or a 15th of the size of America. But I think we shouldn't be thinking about it in terms of the domestic economy. It's what's the massive opportunity for Australia. So 23 billion is a good down payment from Treasurer Chalmers, and it was done in the context of reinforcing and giving substance and commitment to Prime Minister Albanese's Future Made in Australia commitment. And I would say it also adds to the something like 45 billion of capital support that Chalmers put in the budget last year. So a good down payment. We were pushing for 100 billion, but we knew we weren't going to get that all in one budget. But certainly it's been great to see the Albanese government starting to recognise that if the world led by China decarbonises, Australia's got a massive headwind called $220 billion of fossil fuel exports that will eventually go to zero. But against that, we've also got massive critical minerals and strategic metals, and we need to build out that and value add that and build out renewables and pivot our economy. So I'm actually a bit more upbeat than your question implies. I think the budget was a good down payment. I'm hoping Chalmers will give us another 10 or $20 billion down payment in the December 2024 MyEFO, the mid-year economic review.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think maybe I was a bit skewed I think from a biodiversity point of view. But that's really good, Tim. Now, we've got lots of questions, so we might just bring people in. So, Luke, you've got your hand up there. Luke Austin, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, Tim, I just copied an article I'm sure you read on Saturday's Fin from Richard McGregor, which hits on some similar themes about China and the fact that they're leading in a lot of technologies. And instead of taking the US approach of walling them off, we should be joining forces with them and trying to leverage their clear advantage in these technologies. But unfortunately, as you know, we've got a conflict between our economic interests and our climate action interests and where we seem to be heading politically.
Luke, 100% agree with you. You're right. The economic interest, and it's worth bearing in mind, there was a really good chart which I stole from the FT about a month ago and put on my LinkedIn profile, which is showing our export priority. Like, China is our #1 export destination, but it's now more than 30% of our total global exports. China, then daylight, then Japan, and then Korea. America's a distant fourth and flatlining. China is just growing. And so I'm 100% with you. We've got to recognize that we have to chart a different course to America. America is the biggest economy in the world. They've got a massive domestic demand, 280 million people, the #1 economy in the world. So they can afford to wall off China and reindustrialize their economy. They've got a big enough market. We're an export economy. We've got to take a different approach. We're also, we've got the privilege of living in the Asian century, in the Asian time zone, and we have all the critical minerals and resources that Asia needs. That is Asia being China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India. And so I'm 100% with you. We need to actually partner with our #1, #2, #3, #4 trade partners, and we need to collaborate, and we need to work out how we pivot our economy so that we're supplying what our key export partners need. And that's what I talk about, embodied decarbonisation. Like, we export 125 billion a year of iron ore. That could either go down to 50 billion, according to Professor Frank Yotso, if we do nothing, because we've got low quality iron ore. But if we were to actually value add onshore and export green iron, embodied decarbonisation, then our iron ore exports could grow to sort of 200 or 300 billion dollars a year. That's one opportunity. It's the biggest for Australia. But yeah, I'm 100% with you, Luke. We've got to actually embrace technology leaders around the world, industry leaders, and China, in my view, is the industry leader. We've got to work out how to play nicely with them, not kowtow to them. We've got what they need, but we've got to think very differently to America.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Luke. Lex Lynch, I'll bring you in.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks heaps, Tim. That was awesome. I think it was very clear. I'm especially interested in the nuclear side of things. I've been, I think, up there with the nuclear files and the Fifth Estate with Murray Hogarth, and also Renew Economy, who always have great, clear information. With this, you've just given me, and hopefully a lot of people, I guess, some nice little facts that we can use when responding to certain things. Can you help me? Because one of the things, of course, will always come up is all of the coal-fired power stations that are also being built every day in China. What's the latest numbers or facts and figures around this, and how does it compare to those wonderful numbers you gave us around renewables and batteries?
Thanks, Alexi. Yeah, and it's a real glass half empty or quarter empty versus three-quarters full argument. Like, China is the world's biggest builder of coal-fired power plants. And last year they built a absolutely horrific 58 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants in the year. So they built 293 gigawatts of wind and solar, so 6 times as much, but a coal plant in China runs 50% of the time. A wind plant runs 25, 30% of the time, solar only 15 to 20%. So that's a lot of coal. But what the reason why I say it's a glass half empty, it's always, oh, it doesn't matter what we do. China's 20 times bigger than us and they're polluting the world. Well, they're also the #1 investor in every zero emissions industry of the future. And so like their wind and solar installs last year grew 100% year on year. So we saw a massive step change in solar and wind in China. Offshore wind, onshore wind, they were #1 in both in the world. Like 75% of the world's wind installs last year were China. Solar, they were 55% of the world's solar installs. That was up 100%, 150% year on year. Wind was only up 100%. So yeah, it's just staggering when you look at the scale of what they're doing. This year, new coal-fired power plant installs are still horrible, but they're down 50% year on year. Now, why are they still building more of everything? And that's the key question. It's because they're actually electrifying everything. And so there was a really good chart which I took from Rocky Mountain Institute, a report they put out last week, and we double checked the numbers. If you look at it properly defined as the amount of electricity as a percent of the total final energy demand in China, electricity's gone from 10 to about 28% of their total energy needs in the last 20 years. So they've overtaken America, Europe, Australia. We're all sitting around 20%, and they're now at 28%. So what they're doing, just think about it in simple terms, energy comes in the form of oil, imported oil, it comes in the form of gas, it comes in the form of electricity. So what they're doing is saying, we don't want to be beholden on oil imports. So let's move to electric vehicles and therefore move to electricity. As we then electrify everything, we move from imported oil to domestic generated electricity. At the moment, the majority of China's electricity is coming from coal, but in 2024, we expect more than 100% of all new electricity demand to come from zero emissions new sources. So rather than talking about the base demand that was built over the last 20, 30 years, I look at the rate of change. What's the change in energy in 2024, 2023, and how much of that's coming from renewable energy and nuclear and hydro? And the answer is more than 100%. And that's how you get peak emissions. So there's a very good suggestion from Lauri Mertova of Finland, who's been banging the drum for the last 6 months. He's one of the top experts on China energy in the world. And he's suggesting China peaked emissions last year. Now, the data is out, we will see, but their economy is still growing at 5% year on year. When you're still growing at double what Australia or America is growing at every year, you need a lot more energy. So there are a whole lot of factors at play, but the bottom line is China's building 6 times as much wind and solar capacity as they were building coal last year, and now it's about 10 times as much.
Thanks, Tim. That was very interesting, comprehensive. I've got a couple of questions in the chat. 2 of them are along similar lines. From Bruce and Jenny, what energy fuels the EV factories and solar cell factories in China? And then Elisa said, what's the state of the EV infrastructure in China? Are there many charging points throughout the country?
Yeah, I'll take the second one first. NEO is a rather interesting company. It's a startup that only started a couple of years ago, and now it's got the biggest EV battery swapping system in the world. They had a table on the front of when we were going through their factory, talking about how many battery swaps they do. They then took us outside and showed us a battery swap. It takes 3 minutes for an automated swap of your battery. So you literally, we were there, and a local Shanghai resident drives their car in, parks it on this device, sits in the car, plays music or whatever for 3 minutes, and then they drive off, and literally the bottom of the car gets taken off and replaced with a brand new battery. So NIO's done battery swapping. So 3 minutes to recharge your battery effectively. And they have some staggering number, like 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 battery swapping facilities around China. Now, it depends on every month. They've done something like 1.4 million battery swaps. Now, they've rolled out about 40 of them in Europe. NIO's trying to expand into Europe. In China, like they've got, I don't know what the number was, 10, 20, 30,000 battery swap systems. EV charging, like 50% of all cars in Shanghai were electric or plug-in hydro. Not 50% of new cars, 50% of all cars. How do you know that? It's because every EV or plug-in hybrid has a green number plate. And so we were just literally all the time looking as we're driving down massive highways, and they're all electric. On the one point that I missed on the trains, they've electrified and built out unbelievable train networks. So we trained it everywhere. We went to 6 different cities. Some of them were 600, 700, 800 kilometers away. And the fast trains run like clockwork, but they run at 350 kilometers an hour. It's just staggering. So going back to the question from Bruce about what powers the factories, it's powered by electricity. And so at the end of the day, 60% of the electricity comes from coal. But it's about, are they decarbonising their electricity sector? Like Australia, yes, they are. And so, but I mean, the argument that solar modules are made from coal-fired power and therefore they're dirty, well, the energy into a solar module is repaid in about 6 months. So you then get to run the solar module for the next 24, 25, 30 years. And it's effectively repayment. So energy in to energy out for solar modules is something like 30 to 60 times. So I think rather than focusing on China's grid system that they spent 50 years building, we spent 50 years building our grid system. We've run on coal for the last 50 years, but the new system is going to be running on zero emissions technologies. And that's what China's running as fast as they can into. So sure, they've got a dirty grid like Australia, but so did America 15 years ago. America's gone from 50% coal to 15% coal in 15 years. At the end of the day, the technology means China's going to do that faster than America, but yeah, they're coming later to it because they're still growing enormously. Like the country grows at 5% GDP growth per annum, and it's 1.4 billion people. You can't change that on a dime.
Thanks, Tim. That's really interesting. Just talking about these larger sort of population economies. This is a question from Pete. He asked about India. Just how far behind China is India in terms of making big inroads into their own emissions?
Yeah, I've covered India for a decade. I actually stopped covering because I'm focused more on Australia, because finally Australia is actually moving in the right direction, and with a little bit of policy support, like we're seeing with the Future Made in Australia, it could make a massive difference to Australia, and Australia could help decarbonise a big chunk of Asia in the process. So, but India's got enormous promise. India is one of the biggest 2 or 3 fossil fuel importers in the world. Prime Minister Modi is very, very aware that when the Indian economy is growing at 6, 7% GDP growth per annum for 5 or 6 years, they got a massive headwind called fossil fuel imports. And so Modi's, for the last decade, talked about decarbonisation, but at the end of the day, he really focuses on common but differentiated responsibilities. China and the West caused the pollution, so India's got every right to develop and then decarbonise unless it's in their own economic interest to do it. Now, India has talked about deploying domestic zero emissions renewables. It's economically rational. They're not doing it anywhere near as fast as they should. Prime Minister Modi's talking about trebling, quadrupling the number of wind and solar installs that India is doing every year. The economics support it. He's not doing it. he's pursuing an all of the above approach, and he's growing the economy. Well, sorry, India's economy is growing really rapidly. So India's yet to reach anywhere near a tipping point, but it's worth bearing in mind the Chinese economy, the Chinese electricity system's probably 6 times bigger than India. There is no other country like China. So if China reaches peak emissions, then that effectively means the world reaches peak emissions. So we could well have actually already gone past that. We might see that 2023 was peak emissions for the world. But once you get to peak emissions, you then got to actually get it down to zero. And so we need everyone to go a lot faster, and we need to provide a bit more help to emerging markets. So in fact, the next report I'm writing about is China's response. There's a massive trade war America's having with China. Europe's starting to have the same trade war with China. China's response is to go into all the emerging markets and saying, let's actually invest in Indonesia, in Chile, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Hungary, in Africa, and help them decarbonize and build their markets out. And so, yeah, I think that's our next report. China is actually starting to put capital into emerging markets, and that's what the Paris Agreement's all about. It's the rich countries supporting the developing countries. Ironically, the US trade war against China is meaning China is actually complying with the Paris Agreement, unlike America and unlike Europe.
Thanks, Tim. We might make these, we've got 2 more questions in the chat. We might make these the last ones. So the first one's from Martin about gas and asking, given the gas glut that's coming, and just asking about the federal government's gas strategy and driving unbridled gas expansion. Default Beetaloo Basin approved by Middle Arm. Scarborough just had final approval. Santos ploughing in. Wondering if you've got any thoughts there. And then Stuart's popped in about potential change in leadership in the US and their commitment to decarbonisation, and whether that's going to impact their economy and adversely affect our wind and solar products.
Yeah, I'll try and give you a very short answer on both. It's the Albanese government is still walking both sides of the street. At the end of the day, both of our big parties still take fossil fuel donations. So Albo's at least trying to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, Madeleine King, Resource Minister King, is totally at the beck and call of the fossil fuel industry, the gas industry. It's as though Woodside wrote the future gas strategy of Australia. It's appalling. It's absolute regulatory capture by the fossil fuel industry of our government, the multinationals. Yeah, all the crap you read, even the AFR constantly says, oh, we've got a massive looming gas shortage. And I have to constantly remind everyone that we produce 5 times as much gas in Eastern Australia as we use, and we've increased production 300% in the last decade. It's bullshit that there's a shortage. There's a shortage of independent governments acting in the interest of Australians rather than the multinational gas cartel. So, yeah, unfortunately, while the ALP still takes donations from Woodside, Santos, BP, Chevron, Exxon, and you name it, anyone else who's willing to bribe them, they're going to turn a blind eye and ignore the interests of Australia and ignore the climate science. So, yeah, I mean, they're called shit light by Juice Media for a reason. They're still like, that's why I vote Teal or Greens. You've got to get independents who aren't taking donations from the. Well, I'll stop there. You get the point. And the other one, Trump. I'm actually, yeah, obviously there's a high degree of probability Trump will walk away from if he gets in. And there's a high probability of that. America's dumb enough to put in a criminal as president. But I'll put a silver lining on it. America is not leading the world in all of these zero emissions industries. It's one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world alongside Australia. And the fossil fuel industries really control their government. So at the end of the day, what I see is America under Trump will go isolationist. Now, what that'll do is allow the rest of the world to then work with China and Europe as leaders, and China will embrace Europe and go, well, okay, if America going isolationist, why don't we go and collectively dominate the world in all these zero emissions while America just turns inward and ignores it? And so China actually gets to win without even having to have a fight with China, with America. So I would expect, and it's my hope, but I think China will collaborate. Europe's already the world leader in a lot of these industries, but put Europe and China together, America just isolates, and yeah, at the end of the day, the technology is not going to wind it back. So yeah, I actually see that as a silver lining, and so that's why I'm looking at, like, China's investing. They built, BYD just announced a massive billion-dollar factory in Turkey. Well, that's geopolitics at play, and they're doing those factories every single day. It's about actually selling new zero emissions technology, cars that are better, EVs that are better than internal combustion engines, and getting countries like Indonesia to go EV, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, Africa, Turkey, Hungary, etc. And ultimately, the money is going to talk. So anyway, I'll stop there. But I actually think that'll be a silver lining, that China will win the global technology decarbonisation race. They'll ally with Europe, and America will just go isolate and stagnate.
Fantastic, Tim. Well, what a fascinating 40 minutes we've just had. So thank you so much. We've covered a lot, and so engaging. And just on behalf of all of us, thank you. You're out there. You're very loud and outspoken, and we love the way you're directed with everything you say. So thank you so much for everything you do. It's really appreciated by all of us, and thanks for coming along to chat to us today. It's really, really good. Now I'd like to bring Joey into the conversation. Joey Clark. Joey is the Senior Science Communications Lead at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. He's been with them for 8.5 years. He's an ecologist by training, and also spent a couple of years at the CSIRO earlier in his career. And then Joey spoke to our group a few years ago, and tonight he's going to update us on what's been happening since he last spoke. He's going to talk a bit about the Australian Wildlife Conservancy's approach to conservation, recent wins, and also applying scientific research to future-proof threatened species. So thank you so much, Joey, for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. I've got so many slides. I always overload my presentations with too many slides. And one of the reasons for that is that we've got a lot of work going on around the country. So I might skip some bits of this, but you know, it's mostly good stories. They're positive stories. So this is really just a taster of some of the work that Australian Wildlife Conservancy has been doing since I last spoke to the group. I think it was around 2 years ago. Can't remember exactly, but around 2 years ago. It was in COVID anyway, the depths of COVID. I'm just going to swap my screens around. Bear with me for a second. Cool. Okay, and then share the slide. So I hope you can all see that slide.
Great.
Yeah, great. So I thought I'd start with a call that we detected recently. We're using all sorts of different technology now to monitor wildlife, and I hope the audio works here. This is a call that we picked up in the forest recently. And I'll give you a few more slides to guess what that was. Maybe a bunyip, something mysterious. Anyway, I'll come back to that. As you know, Australia is an incredibly diverse country. We've got, you know, the most diverse lizard fauna and snake fauna of any country in the world. Much of our biodiversity is unique and found only here. So, you know, the numbat is an example of that. This incredible marsupial found nowhere else on Earth. It means that if we lose species like the numbat, they're extinct around the world, and we don't get to protect them at all. For many species, it's too late to step in and conserve them. So, you know, we've lost more mammals than any other country in the past 250 odd years, about 40 mammal species, and things are not improving. So the most recent State of the Environment report was published in 2022, but it was for the previous sort of decade. And it showed that overall the status and trend of the environment is poor and deteriorating. We're unable to effectively manage pressures, and that means that we can expect further extinctions, and that unless we drastically change the model that we're using, that's what we'll see. And so with a situation like that, you might expect that, the government would step in and provide really generous funding for a conservation program that does seek to turn things around. I've borrowed this next slide from our partners, the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. If you're not aware of them, a great group of groups similar to AWC that manage private land for conservation. This was their analysis of the most recent budget. So looking at biodiversity spend in particular, so not just environment, but specifically conservation of species, about $492 million, less than 0.1% of the federal budget. Although it's grown 2% over 10 years, the average economic growth outpaces that at 2.4%. So it means that we're seeing an effective decline in investment in biodiversity. And so there's this hole that's left where, government is not effectively conserving biodiversity. National parks go part of the way to protecting, and getting towards that goal of 30% by 2030. But we know that that's not going to be adequate to turn things around. And so that's where Australian Wildlife Conservancy fits in as a large non-profit conservation group dedicated to effective conservation of all of Australian wildlife species. This is where I'll sort of summarize, because I'll direct you to the website too, which has a really good overview of what we do and some of the news stories and things like that. But basically, we're a land management conservation group, and the mission is effective conservation of all Australian animal species and their habitats. And the area over which we work has expanded over the past 3 decades from a couple of private properties in the Perth Hills originally. So Karakamaya was purchased in 1991. We're now a truly national conservation organisation working on private land, partnering with traditional owners in places like the Kimberley and Central Australia. We've also got a couple of partnerships with government. So Yampi Sound is the largest training area owned by the Department of Defence. We manage that area, which is in the order of 700,000 hectares. So a massive chunk of country up there where we've been contracted to improve biodiversity outcomes. And also partnering with pastoralists. So Bullo River in the far northwest of the Northern Territory, that's essentially a cattle station where about 80% of the property is not suitable for grazing cows. And they've invited us on to basically manage it like any other of our sanctuaries. And there's incredible species and biodiversity there, things like Gouldian finches and scaly-tailed possums and lots of cool stuff. So our model is to get access to land by establishing sanctuaries or partnering with other groups, deal with the major threats that are operating. We do have a good understanding of what the threats are at most of these places. So where there's intact habitat, it's all about fire, ferals, and weeds. So if we can restore healthy fire patterns, remove feral animals or control them to the point where they're not significant and get rid of weeds as much as possible, we can have a very good, strong impact on ecological health. All of that is underpinned by a rigorous and comprehensive science program. So we do over 250,000 trap nights every year. So, setting a trap for one night is one trap night. And the data we get from that informs the strategies that we use to manage these places. And we're funded primarily through philanthropy. So I think it's about 70% from private philanthropy, a little bit from contract income, a few corporate partnerships, but by and large, it's individual donors. One of our signature programs is about restoring species back to places from which they've gone extinct. So we've established the largest network of what we call safe havens. You might have heard about these large cat and fox-free fenced areas. These are truly massive. So this photo on the screen is at New Haven in Central Australia, and that's around 9,500 hectares. So the fence itself is 40 kilometers around, and the range you can see on the horizon there, that's entirely encompassed by this fence. So these are 6-foot high electrified fences that are impermeable to cats and foxes, which are those major threats. So we've now got these fenced areas across New South Wales, a few in South Australia, one in the Territory, several in Western Australia, and the most recent one up in Queensland, Mount Zero Taravale, built to literally save the northern bettong from extinction. And we've now got a population of northern bettongs there. So that's something that's changed since I spoke to you last. But I just wanted to go through one case study in a bit more detail. And it starts up in the Kimberley. This is where I started working with AWC. It's an amazing region. This is the northwest part of the Kimberley with very rugged sandstone gorges and ranges, heavily dissected rocks, pockets of rainforest down in the gullies. And when you're camped up there at nighttime, it's absolutely busy with animals. So there are golden-backed tree rats galloping along the branches. There are bandicoots in the undergrowth. There are grass wrens, scaly-tailed possums, lots of species that have gone extinct elsewhere in the north, but they've persisted in the Kimberley because of this rugged terrain that creates a kind of natural sanctuary. And if you camped down by the creek, you might hear the snuffling around the pandanus of the golden bandicoot. So they're about the size of a guinea pig, kind of like an archetype Australian marsupial, feet like little wallabies. They have a pouch, so they're young, grow in a pouch like all marsupials. That's where they do most of their development. And they've got the shortest gestation of any mammal. They're pregnant for about 12 days before giving birth. So amazing, amazing native animals that we know very little about. Ecologically, they're important. They're part of food webs, feeding on invertebrates, fruits, seeds. We know that a lot of these small mammals turn over the soil and unlock nutrients and cycle nutrients. Bandicoots have not fared well since colonization. There were 15 species at the time Europeans arrived, and 5 of those are now extinct. And this one, the golden bandicoot, is one of the species that has declined from about 70 to 80% of its range. So it was found right through the Western deserts, Central Australia, and up into the Kimberley. It's now disappeared from everywhere except that Kimberley coast. And we know that because we've done a lot of science looking at this species. This was one of the papers that we published in the last couple of years, and it just shows the level of detail that we're now putting into the planning around translocations and reintroduction projects. So basically, working with geneticists, we looked at all of the existing populations that have survived, and there's a lot of information here, so I'll just step through it. But the map shows in hashed area is their historical distribution. That inset map of the Kimberley shows where they're found now on the mainland. And luckily, there's also a population on Barrow Island. It's actually about 20,000 of them there, doing pretty well, eating things like turtle eggs, so that there's lots there. So where are they? How many are there? And then importantly, looking at the genetics of, what are the healthiest populations in terms of genetic diversity? And if we wanted to reestablish a population in the desert where they're currently missing, what animals do we need to source and how many from each to get the best mix? So basically, when you're establishing a new population, you want to get those founders to be the best genetic combination that you can. So based on that work, we found that there's very important genetic diversity in the Kimberley. So we had to capture some of that diversity. So Artesian Range is our sort of research station and base up there. It's the last part of that last wild mainland population with the important genetics. Barrow Island has really good numbers, but low genetic diversity. And then part of the sort of benefit of being a national conservation organisation is that we've got one of our sanctuaries within that historical range in Central Australia, and that's called Newhaven. It's about 4 hours west of Alice Springs. And that meant that we were able to source populations. I think it was 60 from the Kimberley, 40 from Barrow Island, and carry out this translocation. And the logistics of that are incredible. So Barrow Island, it's a helicopter offshore, a light plane. So, catching bandicoots over a course of about 3 days, putting them in pet packs, transfer by helicopter to the mainland, and then charter flight right across the Tanami and Great Sandy Deserts to Newhaven. And it was about a year ago that we carried out this translocation from the Kimberley and Barrow Island. And there's a few clips of that. I hope the video is clear enough, showing the transfer. We had this lovely relationship that was built between traditional owners in the Kimberley, who we work with on Willigan country, and the Walpree people who we work with in the Tanami at New Haven. And, you know, that the lady who was receiving that pack there, Alice Numpajimpa Henwood, she remembers a lot of these species being in the desert in her lifetime. So it's, you know, it's within living memory that we've lost this component of biodiversity. And it was lovely to be there as she welcomed back these golden bandicoots as a kind of gift from the traditional owners of Willigan country in the Kimberley. And then releasing them within this 10,000 hectare feral predator-free fenced area at New Haven. So establishing a brand new population of this threatened species, which could easily have slipped off and been added to the extinction list had we not intervened. So just over 12 months later, we're doing trapping to monitor how this population's going. And this photo came in just about 6 weeks ago from the team out there doing the trapping. So fantastic. So these are baby golden bandicoots. They're called joeys. And twins, apparently they're not uncommon to see twins in the pouch. And they've worked out from the genetics that these were third generation. So, you know, the ones that were translocated have bred, and then those animals have also bred. How good is that? So there's now this population of hundreds of golden bandicoots breeding in Central Australia, where 18 months ago they were extinct. This is just one of the translocations that we've carried out over the last couple of years. There's been probably a dozen in the last 12 months, including northern bettongs to Mount Zero, central rock rats also to New Haven. At Mount Gibson in Western Australia, we've now got 10 species that have been restored to that site, and that's a world record. There's nowhere else that's done that number of different species of reintroductions. So that's my yarn about golden bandicoots. And I'm just going to pause and blow my nose. So give me 1 second and get a glass of water.
What a fabulous photo that is.
That's so great, Joey, to hear about how successful the reintroductions have been. It's amazing. And also to hear how you're sort of ramping up and really increasing the speed and what you're doing. And also, personally, I think it's fantastic that you're printing, that you're publishing papers, and you know, you really got the scientific analysis and backing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another component of this which I just can't include everything in these talks, but the climate modeling that we're also introducing into how we plan for reintroduction. So with the golden bandicoot, we did a really thorough assessment of, you know, under 3 different climate scenarios, looking out to 2050, 2080, 2100, which parts of their historic range were still going to be viable under those different scenarios. So the genetics and the climate modeling are sort of shifting and I guess deepening just the rigor of these reintroductions. We've learned a lot about how to do these well and how to make sure these reintroductions are successful over the last 30 years. And now we're applying it. And we've got this incredible team that's out there. You know, we've got a geneticist that lives in Jarvis Bay. We've got a possum PhD guy working for us in Alice Springs. We've got about 70 scientists through the organization, and they bring all of their different expertise. And in a translocation like this, you're drawing on all of that to bring it together. It's really, really cool. The one other project that I'll share this evening is a brand new sanctuary north of Sydney. Excuse me. It's called Wallenbach, and it's basically between Barrington Tops and the Mid-North Coast. So AWC we've never had much of a presence in the southeast, partly because there just hasn't been the opportunity to work at scale, and partly because real estate is so unaffordable. It was difficult for us to get anywhere where we thought we could do a, you know, good-sized project and make a big difference. Excuse me. So thanks to a couple of really, really generous philanthropists, we were able to purchase this property when it came up for sale. excuse me. It's very diverse. It's about 4,000 hectares. And you can see on the map here, it's part of a corridor that sort of connects that Barrington Tops patch with Mid-North Coast and Mile Lakes National Park. So in one sense, it's that east-west connectivity. It's discontinuous, but it's an important part of that. If you zoom out a bit, it's also part of the... Sorry, I'm just going to take another break for a minute. It's also part of that band of forest along the Great Dividing Range. So both east-west and north-south, it's a really important place for us to be. It's in prime koala habitat. And over the past year and a half since we've been working there, we've been doing surveys for all sorts of animals. So that first stage is very exciting because you're kind of doing the inventory, the baseline monitoring to work out what's there before you go in and start managing it. So, so far, we've detected 177 species of vertebrate animals, and we expect that could well get up towards 300 or even more. 20 threatened species have been confirmed. So across the AWC portfolio, this is about number 5 in terms of the number of threatened species. And that's unexpected. That's a lot more threatened species than we thought might be found here. Super exciting. And, you know, that ranges from spotted-tailed quolls to a leaf-tailed gecko, very special leaf-tailed gecko, glossy black cockatoos. A lot of these species are things that were very badly affected in the Black Summer bushfires. So having a presence in that southeast forests means we can make a difference for those species, which we haven't previously, you know, had much to work with. In terms of koalas, and you might have guessed the call from earlier was a koala call that was detected on one of the acoustic recorders up there. This map shows areas that have been mapped as highly significant for koalas in New South Wales, where they're listed as endangered. It's always funny talking to ecologists about koalas. Some of them really hate koalas. They're apparently unpleasant animals to work with, really scratchy and grumpy, quite smelly, and just not that nice compared to other marsupials. So that's, you know, the dark underbelly of koalas that you don't always hear about. Beautiful population of spotted-tailed quolls. They caught one last week, actually, and I was up there the next day. I missed it. But, you know, mainland Australia's largest marsupial predator. They're feeding on, you know, birds and frogs and reptiles and all sorts of stuff. To have a healthy population of an apex predator like that is a good indication that the ecosystem is in good health. And then using, I mentioned acoustic monitors. So here's that koala call again. Quite enough of that. And camera traps, which we use across all of our sanctuaries. They're amazing. You know, you can set up 20 camera traps, leave them out for 3 months. And we've now got artificial intelligence that can filter through the images and say, you've probably got a wallaby here. This is maybe a potteroo. And then, then we can go and check. There is actually an animal in this photo. So sorry. Just its nose, which you might be able to detect there. A koala, the nose of a koala. And in the following photo from a different site, finally, confirmation that we had koalas there. We really expected they were there, but this was the first definitive evidence that they were present on Wallenbach. So that's an update on our newest project. It's exciting because it's within a day's drive of Sydney, so we can actually take people up there and show them the work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna call it quits there because my voice is giving out. Happy to take any questions in between sips of water.
Yeah, have a sip of water. And Joey, I've just loved that section. To see the pictures of some of the animals. It's amazing. And yeah, great to see the property so close to relatively close to Sydney too. I can see David's got his hand up, but I also was going to mention there's a couple of questions in the chat. So there's one about weeds in New South Wales and weed control, and also one about feral cats in New South Wales. So perhaps you might cover those two first.
Sure. Is this just in the chat or?
Yeah, it's just in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
I give a little context to the weed question. I just travelled back from Tamworth on the train yesterday and was struck by how, you know, railway corridors can be actually quite important corridors for wildlife, but at the same time, you know, the infestation of particular weeds that thrive in the corridors, and I could see they weren't in the farmlands, but they were, you know, right through the whole corridor, castor oil, for example, and they just you know, it just frustrates the hell out of me that you know, government has policy but won't enact policy on land it controls. And you know, I know it's a resourcing issue. I know it's expensive to control weeds, but you know, sometimes it feels like they've thrown their hands up and said, you know, it's all too hard. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And the other question I had was around the cats issue, which is obviously a huge issue. I thought it might be a problem in that New South Wales area you were describing.
Yeah, I'll start with cats. So cats are everywhere. So we've done studies across Cape York, those bits of the Kimberley I was talking about, the desert, like middle of Central Australia. Even in very, very dry years, we get cats on camera traps there. We've got quite a few photos now where the camera trap is set up inside one of our fenced areas, and you'll see a bilby hopping past. And then outside the fence, literally in the same frame, you'll have a cat patrolling, you know, walking up and down, just licking its lips, you know, trying to get inside to all those beautiful reintroduced mammals. So yeah, we know that these fenced safe havens work. So that's one thing we can do: establish large, you know, substantial areas which are completely free of cats. In the scheme of things, that's a medium-term solution. So yes, that will stop things going extinct. It's not restoring, you know, bettongs and bandicoots back to substantial, really, really substantial areas of mainland Australia. For that, we need something new, and it doesn't exist at the moment. There's prospects with genetic technologies that might be able to control populations of cats. At the new property, we were doing cage trapping for cats, which is when they caught the quoll. So it's nice that the quoll was the first thing to turn up rather than a feral cat, although we know they're there from camera trap images. So we'll do everything we can to suppress that population as much as possible. As for weeds, depends what region we're talking about. So, you know, working across Australia, there's a range of sort of different threats. But one update that I think is sort of interesting is about buffel grass in the Northern Territory. So it was introduced as a grazing grass, so to sort of enrich the pasture for cattle. The problem is it forms this blanket, which is a very high fuel load. So it changes how fire moves through the desert. We do a lot of prescribed burning, a lot of planned burning, but when there's heavy infestations of buffel grass, you get big hot fires that cover big areas. They burn thoroughly, and they don't leave refuges for native animals. So, you know, we're lucky in that the buffel grass on the places we manage in the centre, New Haven, and the next door property, Nalaju, it's relatively limited, and we have, you know, really good hygiene protocols to make sure that we're not spreading it through our activities. Yeah, it's really got to be a regional approach for things like that, and I think that needs to be led by government. That's my instinct. Things like lantana, so the new property, Wallenbach in New South Wales, there is lantana along the watercourses, but that's something where we've got lots of experience from our sanctuaries in Queensland, and we are able to get on top of that given enough time. So, you know, I expect in even 5 or 10 years, we'll be able to get quite good control of lantana and remove most of the infestations. And it's spraying, it's physically, you know, cutting into it and creating barriers. And then importantly, using fire. So we can actually use fire as a tool to control some of the weeds where that works. So yeah, weeds, it's always complicated, and it's kind of the least sexy of the work that we do. But it's so important. And I think the other thing is to make sure with any new weeds, and there was a press release today from the Invasive Species Council, getting on top of them before they bolt, because once they're bolted, you know, there are some weeds that you have to give up on. Yeah.
Thanks, Joey. Julie, should we go over to you? You're such a great supporter of AWC.
Oh,
I know.
Hi, Joey.
Hello.
I met Joey first when he was up in the Kimberley then. Now, Joey went through uni with my daughter as well.
That's
and
right.
we've just come back from Piccadilly and off to Calmarinia. But
Oh,
my question is, given how involved AWC is and how great it is, and Bush Heritage as well, and you know, and taking on the role with the Northern Australian Pastoral Company, how much of a danger is it that the federal government just says, wash our hands of this, let's just leave it to private organisations?
I hope that's not the effect of sort of, you know, being an effective conservation group means that we're, you know, making the government feel like they can give up that responsibility. I personally think there's a really important, critical role for government to play. Yeah, and I guess the best work we're doing, AWC is very purposefully not a lobbying organization. So we don't do sort of campaigns for policy change. That's not our role. So our expertise is managing land for conservation in the best way possible with the best science. We do that really, really well, and we think that's a template that can be used by other conservation land managers. Through that slide I had about the budget from the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, that's a really good vehicle for us, Bush Heritage, Tasmanian Land Conservancy, Landcare, and lots of others to actually lobby for, you know, government to make changes that make sense for conservation outside of the traditional national park estate of, you know, conservation land on sort of reserves. And we know that that's really important because about 50% of the Australian mainland is under some form of pastoralism. So if we're just, you know, leaving it up to national parks, which are, you know, managed differently in different states, not always effectively, we're going to lose a lot. And there's lots of threatened species that are only found on pastoral land as well. So yeah, I think, you know, if the problem is that we're doing too good a job, then fine. I would hope, you know, by doing the best effective conservation that we can, we're setting a template that can be adopted across public land, across private land. You know, we've seen governments embrace that with partnerships in New South Wales, where we've contracted to manage part of the Pilliga and Mallee Cliffs National Park, where at each of those sites we've built one of these fenced safe havens and restored 10 mammals that were extinct in New South Wales. So yeah, I think it is, you know, the theory at least is advancing really quickly. We're getting better at delivering conservation. It's sort of not rocket science. Like if you know, fire, ferals, and weeds, they're the threats. We've got a pretty good working understanding of what these ecosystems need when they're in good condition. And yeah, I think the political will and that leadership is required to do this sort of work across a much bigger area.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Joey. We'll wind things up there. So a huge thank you to you. You've soldiered on there very well. Thank you. And thanks for sharing that update on the really fabulous work that AWC are doing. It's really good to see. So well done, and you know, keep up the great work.
Thank you. If I could just direct people. So the website has so much good stuff on it, australianwildlife.org. You can subscribe to the newsletter, and that's really good. So there's updates every other week with, you know, all of these sorts of projects. I also run webinars once a month, and it's basically me chatting to one of the ecologists in the field. I've got one coming up on Thursday, speaking to a bird bander who does bird research at our Queensland sanctuaries. So yeah, it's all on the website. But yeah, that's final pitch. Thank you, Stephen.
Oh, that's great, Joey. And when we send the notes around, we'll put the links in for all those as well. So thanks so much. So just bringing it to a close today, what a fabulous hour and a bit we've had. So hope you've all enjoyed tonight's session and feel that you've learnt a lot from both Tim and from Joey. Both are leading in different ways on the environment and biodiversity. And thank you to both of our speakers tonight who are doing such a fabulous job. We're really grateful to both of you for everything you do and supportive of the fabulous work you're doing. So thank you both so much. We've got a fantastic lineup of sessions over the coming months. So next month, we've got Blair Police speaking to us. Blair is the Director of Philanthropy at Ethinvest. She also has an incredible background going back many years in supporting the environment. She's worked with Greenpeace as a board director, the Sustainable Energy Development Authority, the Green Building Council of Australia, and the Antarctic Ocean Alliance, amongst many others. And then in September, we've got Tina Jackson. Tina is the co-founder and executive director of the Community Independence Project. And they're doing really great work on developing a pipeline of independence to get into federal parliament. So Tina will share some of that with us as well. So lots of good things coming up. Also, a few weeks ago, I sent around a questionnaire about our group, which would be great if you wouldn't mind filling in. We've had lots of people fill it in already. So if you have, thank you. If you haven't, we're really keen to get your feedback so that we can keep building this group and making sure it's giving all of you what you're looking for. So I'll send that around again tomorrow. And thanks again to all of you for coming along on a Monday evening like this. Keep spreading the word, please, within your groups and your networks, because that's how our group is growing. You know, we've now got over 500 members all around Australia in our group, and everyone's always very welcome. So thanks again, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
See ya.